Hi everyone, I'm Mims and welcome to the channel. Thanks for being here. So today I wanted to wrap up the cups in the Drop 'em 78. I'm recording this on a Wednesday, so technically today is actually the Ace of Swords Day, but the suit of cups wrapped up yesterday and I had a little bit of time, so I thought I would make this video. I was going to try to make this video yesterday and I just didn't get to it. So I'm making it now and then I'm going to post it almost immediately after. So very quickly, just in case any of you don't know, I think I already said, but hi, I'm Mims if I didn't say that earlier. Let me just tell you briefly what Drop 'em 78 is in case you happen upon this video. Drop 'em 78 is a tarot challenge that Esther from Mindful Tarot started a few years ago, and it is the last 78 days of the year. It's from October the 15th through December 31st, and the acronym is drop, anchor with the pentacles, respond with the wands, open up with the cups, pierce through with the swords, and then manifest with the majors. And that's the order. So it's pentacles, wands, cups, swords, and then majors. And you do each set, it's a card a day. So yesterday would have been, and you do Ace through King. So yesterday was the King of Cups day. Today, Wednesday, is the Ace of Swords day, just as a thing. And there's a lot of different ways you can participate. You can do it on social media. You can, so what I've, and then, you know, there's opportunities to, well, she talks about the dimensions. So one is like, you know, what's the meaning of that card? You know, whatever the card of the day is, what's the meaning of that card? And then the second, I forget how all the dimensions are, but one is like, what's the meaning of the card? Then another is look at the card that you're using, you know, look at the deck that you're using and what do you notice in that card that day? Not necessarily in like an art history way and not necessarily in a learning tarot way, but just, you know, what do you notice? If it's a deck you've used before, what springs to mind? Or if it's a new deck, what pops out at you? And how does that reflect upon the meaning of that card and so forth? And then how is your card, or how is your day like a King of Cups day yesterday? Or how is your day like an Ace of Swords day? You know, whatever that day is. And then if you want, you can use a second deck as what she calls a calibration tool. And she also talks, it doesn't have to be a deck. It could be another divination. It could be runes. You could do Lenormand. I chose to use a second deck for tarot, and I'm comparing the same cards. I have a tarot buddy. We were going to be sort of tarot buddies for this, and I kind of fallen off on texting and showing my cards. And so I haven't been a good tarot buddy, but I know that she was doing it where she had one card, you know, she was using one deck, and then her second deck, she was just pulling a card and then using that second card as maybe like another point of reflection. So anyway, I'm using the American Renaissance Tarot, and I'm using the Pixie's Line Art Tarot, which is a black and white Waite Smith deck published by Vieux Press. I will include details below about both the challenge as well as the decks that I'm using, and I'm just showing you the cards without getting a lot into it. The American Renaissance Tarot was new to me. I got it near the end of September, and then the challenge began in mid-October. One of the reasons I decided to do the challenge with this deck is this deck has a lot going on in terms of using the guidebook more. You can see that in some cards, you know, the posture is similar to, and it's definitely in the Waite Smith tradition, but the card also, or the deck also has a lot with history and things, and so looking at the cards, not necessarily obvious, like who's in that card and what does that actually represent. So I've enjoyed it because it has been, the American Renaissance Tarot deck is all about is focused on history and literature of a particular time frame, somewhere in the 1820 to 1870 range, and I really like it for that. But I also, and at some point maybe I'll do a video about like a long-term use of this deck. But one of the things that I really like about this deck, so right now it has been good because I can dive into the guidebook, read a little bit more, even though I'm not quite doing it like a deck study. I do think Drop 'em 78 is a great way to get to know a new deck or a deck that you just want to learn more without necessarily doing it as a deck study, but just examining them card by card. So it does feel like it's been a good way to get a glimpse of more of what the card means. But I do like that, but even without that in the future, if I'm using this deck, funny when I'm talking about the future, like I can see it in the cards, but ha ha ha. Anyway, but even with that the cards are still labeled. So even if that scene, well, that one's kind of obvious, it does look sort of like the 10 of Cups, but every card is labeled. So even if I'm not grabbing even if I didn't grab the guidebook, I would know what that means just knowing what the 10 of Cups is. And so I do appreciate it for that. You know, even if I don't recall, like, you know, if it's a year later and I'm using this deck and I'm like, I don't remember who's in that, and I don't have the guidebook nearby, I could still just read it as and the pioneers are the knight or the pages, and the missionaries are the knights, and then the queens and kings are the same. So I do appreciate it on both levels, that I could read it surface level like another tarot deck, but also then that I can use the guidebook and really dive in. And there's definitely, you know, a depth of meaning, you know, getting into the guidebook. Okay, so those are the cups. So what came to mind, or what was I thinking about? What was I thinking about during this time? And I'm going to try to wrap this up because my camera battery is lower than I realized. Well, I made a cup of tea right before this, and it made me think about, okay, cups of tea. Made me think of the phrase spilling the tea. You know, when people sit down and chat and maybe a little bit of gossip. It also made me think of the phrase, my cup runneth over. And then that immediately made me think of the Ace of Cups in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. You know, the cup is spilling over and it looks like a fountain. And there's a deck that I just used recently, and it's a pip deck, and I can't think which one it is, but the 6 of Cups, for whatever reason I can picture it, and there's 6 cups and they're lined up. It might be a Marseille deck, I don't know, but the cups are spilling and it looks like a fountain, and that was kind of in my head. And when we think about cups, elementally water, we also consider emotions and feelings and relationships, and then love, you know. So I often am not thinking about romantic relationships, but it, you know, it could be familial relationships, it could be the relationship you have with your roommate, it could be the relationship you have with your neighbor, good or bad, or anything in between. There's no good or bad to me. I think it's a lot of different stuff. Anyway, that made me think of that. And then I was thinking about, in books, often people will talk about, or like in the way that emotions are written, you know, it might say like emotions spilled over, or tears spilled over, or and it made me think of tears. And then I thought about tears and cups, and immediately I thought of sadness, but then I thought about, I have cried in times of grief. I have cried, not so much in this past couple of weeks, but I was just thinking about cups and that thing of cups and spilling. And I thought about tears, and I definitely have cried when I've been sad, but I've cried when I was happy. I've also cried in anger and rage, like angry tears. I've cried in frustration, and I've also cried in like times of just sheer exhaustion. Tears bring release, and often our emotions get bottled up. Interesting, bottled, right? We think of our emotions often as liquid and fluid, right? One of the best life tips that I've ever gotten was in therapy. I went to therapy for about almost exactly 2 years. This was several years ago. And one of the very first sessions with my therapist, I said, I want tangible things that will help me in my day-to-day. I want tools, techniques, etc. I value the talking, but I want things that will help me in the day-to-day, in life. And she was like, okay. And one of the first ones she gave me, and I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, that was worth it alone. The tip was and she said, do this in the car. She said, or, and you can whisper. She said, if you're alone, you could say it out loud. But she said, you can do it anywhere. When you're feeling something, name that emotion. And that it doesn't have to be just naming your so-called bad feelings. Just name your feelings. And then she said, because if you can do that, for one, you're then more in touch with yourself. The second part is when you can name them. And she said, don't worry about the thesaurus aspect. This is just for you. So saying sad, mad, bad, glad, whatever, that's fine. Like use kindergarten terms if that works. But she said, just by naming the emotion, you're acknowledging how you're feeling. And you're also stepping out of it and observing it. Just by that simple act of naming them. And then sometimes, if you say that you're sad or you're mad, you might have to go a little further. And then the next step could be maybe journaling or talking out loud, depending, or talking with someone else if that's appropriate. You might get into the why you're feeling that. I'm feeling frustrated because the driver in front of me cut me off. Okay. Good. Now I know why I'm so wound up by the time I get home. Now, some of those are obvious, but not always. And she said sometimes you'll notice that just by naming the feeling, it's going to just go away like a bubble. And then other times she said, you'll have a feeling and then there'll be other feelings underneath it. And there might be a whole bunch. If you feel like you're in a knot, it might be that you have to acknowledge the knot might be partly you don't know what you're feeling. And so that's the knot. And then slowly kind of untying it or thinking about each of those feelings. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling angry about work. I'm feeling tired because I haven't gotten enough sleep all week. I'm making these up. But, those are some examples. And she said, and then you can imagine those bubbles sort of like floating away. Like when you think of like soap bubbles. But she said other times you might name the feeling and it might sit there for a while. And she said our instinct often is to chase away our feelings. That's why we might eat a lot or drink or smoke. And again, I'm not getting into the therapy aspects here. I'm just talking about what she mentioned. And maybe this is obvious to a lot of people, but it wasn't obvious to me. And she would talk to me a lot about, she said, get into your feelings. You're in your head right now. And I'm like, yeah, because I can't deal with this. But anyway, that was one of the best. And I pass it on. If it's helpful, great. If not, I just wanted to mention it because it is about feelings. And so I have been thinking about that a lot in these last couple of weeks because I have been thinking about, and I've also been thinking a lot about family relationships. We're coming up on, today's Wednesday when I'm recording this. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. Whether or not you celebrate it in the United States, it has a problematic history. Some people love it. The holiday itself, maybe not all of the history of it, but it can often be, you know, time with family for some is loving, and for others it brings up a lot of emotions, right? And if we think about tarot, I'm bringing it back now. When we think about tarot, whether we read for ourselves or we read for others, often the readings that we do have a lot to do with our feelings about all the other things, right? The question might be about finances or a new relationship or the ending of a relationship. But there's a component that's also about, even if it's not acknowledged, it's about how do you feel about the end of that relationship? How do you feel about the beginning of this relationship? How do you feel about your finances? How do you feel about this new job, right? The question might be more situational, right? I think people talk a lot about, it's often about love or money, you know, but it's also, how do you feel about those? So the cups kind of come down to it. And I also thought about, you know, like I was talking earlier about, you know, crying in anger and sadness, in grief, in just exhaustion. And then I thought about a quote from one of my favorite movies. I think I mentioned this. I maybe mentioned this in the last video. I can't remember. But the quote's from Steel Magnolias, and Dolly Parton's character, Truvy, says it. And she says, laughter through tears is my favorite emotion. Now, the scene in that movie, they're crying after a funeral. They're laughing, though, at the end of a funeral. You know, and sometimes we rush to humor to cover up sadness or whatever. But she didn't say laughter through sadness is my favorite emotion. She said laughter through tears. So those tears could be frustration or sadness or anything. Anyway, it just made me think of that. And like I said, I don't have any big epiphanies. I did have a little epiphany with on a dog walk. I did have a little epiphany about a relationship that I have, a familial relationship. And it was helpful because I've been really frustrated with it. And so, you know, sometimes there can be insight, especially when you can step away from phones. That's, people talk about like getting in the shower is often a great way to like have a shower and feelings and water. Interesting. But I did have a little epiphany yesterday, and I think it will be helpful, at least how I'm showing up in this relationship. And also just, it gave me a little perspective. And I think when we consider our emotions, we often get frustrated or anger. And in fact, there was another, I learned this in a class that I took. People, when you're talking about your emotions, when you get to anger and rage and frustration, usually you can keep digging to get to other emotions. There's usually other emotions underneath that. And that's coming from like therapists. I'm not making this stuff up. And so that's interesting because, you know, and the other big thing is, do we get to acknowledge our feelings, even just to ourselves? Do we get to express them? Do others get to express how they feel? And then why there's so much going on in the world. I don't mean to simplify the world's problems in a little thing, but, you know, if my frustration could cause me to honk the horn at somebody and then that causes them to be angry, you know, the ripple effect, the spill effect, right? It does ripple, and we think of water rippling, right? You think of the waves and so forth. And so I'm not saying the answer to world peace is easy, like not at all. But if we can acknowledge even just to ourselves how we feel, that's a beginning, I think. Anyway, I'm just pondering at this point. I hope you're well. If you're doing Drop M 78, how's it going for you? I hope you have a wonderful rest of the month. There's just a few days left. If you're in the US and you celebrate Thanksgiving, peace to you. And if you're in the rest of the world, peace to you as well. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're finding joy. I hope you're feeling those emotions. I hope that you are finding ways to take care of yourself and finding ways to take care of the earth and others in a mutual aid way. And I hope to see you in another video. And please find some joy. Take care.